Hello and welcome to today's webinar. This is Mike Steckline, partner with the Institute for Enterprise Excellence. Hope everyone's having a good day. On this webinar, I'm going to walk through some of the updates to our series of white papers and also describe some of the newest white papers that have been added to the list. And also there's some announcements about some upcoming webinars we've been working on. So I'm going to move this forward. Just a few housekeeping details. For now, the phones will be muted, but there's going to be some time to unmute later to get some input and feedback. You can always use the chat function if you want to type some questions. I'm recording this webinar so that you and others that want to benefit from the discussion can have access to it in the future. So one of the things I wanted to just describe is why are we publishing white papers? What is the benefit of this? And I pulled a definition from the Wikipedia about what a white paper is. They describe it as an authoritative report or guide that informs readers concisely about a complex issue, presents the issuing body's philosophy on the matter. It is meant to help readers understand an issue, solve a problem, or make a decision. I thought that was a pretty useful description. I wanted to say a little bit more about that specifically for us. Of course, you could always publish a book, and a book may be in the offing in the future, but one of the things that we try to do is to update our current best thinking on various topics. Also, we want to reference to theories that are based on solid science, whether it's science of psychology, science of systems, science of philosophy, science of management, and we want the connections that we describe to be solidly based on science, and we think that's important. We also want to relate this to what's happening in the field by people really doing the work. And then finally, it's a source of branding and also capturing our intellectual property. It isn't uncommon for us to see presentations or comments that are out there, and we notice that someone is describing something that came from us, but there isn't always a citation citing the original source, which we think is unfair, but we continue to try to outline these things. So it's a source of designating if we synthesize different topics and put them together, we want to at least capture that with a date and associate our name to it. A term that we've used in the past is, and continue to use, is thinking of ourselves as pracademics. In terms of what is a pracademic? Well, thinking in terms of an iceberg. There's the things you see on the surface, and those show up as tools, also behaviors, different methods, but there's something underneath the surface, and we can talk about that as being processes, systems, theories, and we think it's the interaction of both. So we want to have a median between making sure that we're paying attention to the theory and updating the theory, again, based on solid science, but also making sure that it's pertinent in the real world. We say a little bit more about the pracademic term in the white paper that you see, Pracademic's Guide to Strategy Deployment. You can see the bit.ly link on that page. So I'm already sort of getting into the white papers here, but I'll be talking about that in a little bit. Anyone who wants to access the white papers can find them a couple ways. If you go to our website, which you can see the URL listed at the top, you go to the Foundations page, and that's one way that we've outlined the bodies of knowledge under the white papers. Another way is to go under Publications, and you can see the white papers that are listed there. So there's two ways to readily access those white papers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be going through each of the white papers, just describe briefly what they're about if people haven't had access to them, and associate them with some bit.ly links. And you can see the numbers on the bit.ly links change over time, and that's because we do have updates. We do try to connect these white papers to each other. So for instance, if someone picks up a white paper and there's a reference to other white papers, they can readily access a new topic that's related that they might want to learn about. So the white paper that started it all is a white paper on the foundations course, which then describes a little bit about two models. It describes, first of all, we say something about culture and people wanting to have a culture of continuous improvement, but we also parse out and explain the relationship between the climate that is set by leaders, regardless of what leadership role a person might be in the organization, and the association with climate or culture. We also talk about the sustainability model and our description about the pitfalls that people fall into with flavor of the month approach or the quick win approach, whether it's something that they try in a department or across an organization. Inevitably, the program path turning counterclockwise always leads to sort of a flavor of the month feel, and people just wait until the next program to come along for management. And in this paper, we describe a different pathway, turning clockwise, to think about a philosophy committed to excellence and what that pathway looks like. So that's our description of what we call a sustainability model. We also describe what we call a velocity model, which has to do with thinking about the principles, the systems, and the tools in the domains of aligning, enabling, and improving. And how you think about adjusting the velocity of your transformation, and this as being a three-pedal machine that you need to have steady pressure on all three pedals. And many organizations are pushing pretty hard on one, which is primarily the improve, but not necessarily pushing on the others. Also, we've noticed that a lot of what we seem to be doing is lean cleanup. So as organizations attempt to pursue a lean transformation, they find themselves at a dead end, or at least frustrated about what's going on or not going on. And it's a term that we've found ourselves using. And a lot of what our approach is described in this white paper that you see, that you can find at that bit.ly link, the latest version of that. So with that as a foundation, the next white paper that we wrote has to do with how this pertains to education. In particular, we were looking at kindergarten through 12th grade education. And a lot of this was with the help of leaders at Kimberly Area School District in Wisconsin, and most notably Holly Prast, an assistant superintendent there, has given a lot of her time and a lot of her thoughts about how this pertains to the education world. And so a lot of the things were similar, but you're going to find some things that are different in this white paper. And if you're interested in this, here's some things I'd like to point out. We talked about the flavor of the month approach that happens in management. Holly pointed out there's been education fads over time, and there's a nice listing of those. And also with education, just like other industries, I would suppose, there is a huge impact on legislation that it's a constraint that they deal with, that they have to think about certain things and factor those into the work that they do. Relative to the triangle that I showed previously, and typically when we're thinking about aligning, enabling, improving, what's in the middle of that triangle is work systems, regardless of whatever work system you happen to be working on. And what Holly and her colleagues at Kimberly Area School District noticed is, at least in the classroom, it's less about a work system and more about a learning system. So there have been some great discussions around that, and you can read some of those in the white paper. And also this notion of problem solving. In most organizations, we think about a problem solving system that is primarily around, let's say, a improve corner of that dimension. But the way they're thinking about it, and it is very interesting, is helping to have children, as they work through their adolescent years, become better problem solvers. So it's an interesting exercise. They got a lot of great stuff to say about this. And relative to the principles that we talk about in our first white paper, they also connect principles of education to this. And I think this could be pertinent for other organizations as well, certainly pertinent for education. But whether you're dealing with little people or big people, I think the principles of education are going to come to mind. So I think you would find great benefit to studying that white paper, and you can find that at that bit.ly link. So the next white paper that was written, we called the Evolving Worldview. And this white paper has to do with how ideas change over time. The S-curve concept is illustrated in this white paper. Whether it's the idea of moving from the agricultural age to the industrial age to the knowledge age, and how ideas take hold or don't. And the latest iteration also includes some commentary from what we've been learning with the connection to the Cognitive Edge website, Dave Snowden and his group. And they have done a lot of work with the Cynefin model, which I'll say a little bit about later. But also they describe what's called the apex predator model that I think you might find some good benefit there. But again, we're talking about here's a diagram from that paper. We talk about something happened starting, say, in the 1950s, and a lot of it had to do with Dr. Deming and Joseph Juran and others, where Japanese companies took a different pathway than did Western management. And in the late 1990s and 2000s, people like James Womack and Daniel Jones, when they wrote the Machine That Changed the World, describing Toyota, what they were noticing was a philosophy of management that has been improving and adjusting over time. And that is fundamentally different than what Western management did. There was a bifurcation, again, that occurred, let's say, in the 1950s after World War II. There was a different problem that Western management was solving. It wasn't a problem of quality, it was a problem of quantity. So anyway, we unpacked that a little bit, quite a bit, in this white paper. And if you're interested in paradigm shifts and how worldviews change, you might benefit from studying that white paper. So the next white paper that we described has to do with what we called practical wisdom. And a lot of this came about through the thinking of a philosopher, John Edelman, and we cited him and talked with him about his contributions to this, and it made a lot of sense. One of the reasons why this white paper was put together is it is one explanation about why people will so often fall into the flavor of the month trap, or what we call the comfort of the comfort zone. And with this, you see different waves of ideas that have been put forward over time, going back to different things. And you can put different acronyms there: TQM, CQI, Six Sigma, Lean. You could put Shingo there. You could put Baldrige there. High reliability organization is something that has been cited primarily in healthcare and also patient experience. But again, it's a pattern of different waves that occur over time. And people are hoping for the next new wonderful thing that's going to solve the problems. And in this paper, one of the reasons we describe why this seems to occur is people don't understand the difference between the different types of knowledge that's needed to solve different types of problems. Thinking about the difference between convergent problems and divergent problems, and the problems that we deal with in the world when we're dealing with people are more toward the divergent side, which don't come with easy recipes with 1 through 10 lists, but require what's called the balancing of opposites. So anyway, if you want to study that a little bit more, you can find it in that white paper that you see on that bit.ly link. The next white paper that came about is around one approach for deploying this, call it a principle-based approach in organizations. And this swim lane concept has evolved over time, and this is the latest iteration of it. And it's a general description of one way that we've seen that does work relative to how do you deploy this. Now, in the next couple of months, we're going to be having some webinars with some colleagues, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later, about challenges in deployment. And I'm going to lead off those webinars, and I'm going to be referring to this white paper, so that if anyone would like some description about at least one way that seems to have a durable, sustainable pathway, we describe it, at least at a high level, in this white paper that you see here. So after the deployment paper came about, there was a realization that it goes back to some of the first initial steps where people are learning about these different principles, a realization that people would benefit from more study and learning about these principles. So 3 white papers were put together, one each around each of the corners around that triangle that I showed. So there is a white paper on the align principles. These 3 that you see listed here: assure constancy of purpose, create value for the customer, think systemically. And in those white papers, there's at least a beginning discussion that has some definitions, connects to some of the foundational truths, the consequences of both understanding or ignoring or not understanding each of those principles, and then some guidance on what some of the ideal behaviors might be if someone really understood those principles. So there's also some activity that's going on relative to our blog, and I'll be saying a little bit more about that. We have a weekly reflection that's out on our blog that people want to dig deeper and study these principles a little bit more can take advantage of that. So I'll be showing that a little bit later. If you want to go directly and see what's been discussed thus far, you can go to that URL that's listed there. So align principles is one paper, enable principles is another paper, and these diagrams that I'm showing on the upper left-hand corner are the diagrams that show up if you go to the foundations page of our website. And so we have discussion around these principles: respect every individual, lead with humility, and learn continuously. And then finally, the 3rd paper has a bit more discussion around the improve principles, which it seems that many people are familiar with as they get into this improvement work. And again, it goes back to the velocity model about, is there a balanced view, of balanced understanding of the principles of align as well as the principles of enable. So that's what you'll find in those white papers, at least the latest iterations. So what happened next is, again, as people are learning more about how do you deploy this, there is a method that we describe, and we've helped organizations, and perhaps some of the people on today's webinar, and I know some of the people that will be presenting in the next couple months, have taken advantage of a methodology that we describe, usually unpacking it in a 1 or a 2-day session offering at an organization, helping them to understand how would you go about adjusting or designing a key system that you wanted to adjust. And we start with those systems around alignment, systems around enabling, systems around improvement, using what we call the IEX system standard. It's an approach, it's a framework. Lately, you'll see language in this white paper thinking of it as a sort of scaffolding to hang on to as you're trying to work first on the system. What is it that needs to be done to frame whatever system you're working on? And then turning attention to experiments, which has to do with working in the system and what those experiments are going to look like. And we've introduced some of the Cynefin model into this because I think it's important. And as you study the Cynefin sense-making framework, again, attributed to Dave Snowden and the people at the Cognitive Edge, I think there's real utility for understanding the difference between, so what kind of a situation am I dealing with? Am I dealing with something that's complex? There's going to be a one approach. If I'm dealing something that's complicated, but there is some cause and effect, then there's going to be another approach. And if I'm dealing something with obvious, that's the lower right-hand corner, well, that's going to be a different approach. But if I mix those up and I treat everything as if it was obvious, And this is, again, one of the problems with why people fail with some of this work, or at least struggle, is they assume everything needs to be distilled down into a, call it standard work that needs to be followed by everyone. And it has some risks to it. So we touch a little bit upon that in this white paper, Systems by Design. The next white paper that came up had to do with what we call true north. And this has to do with an understanding beyond what people typically associate with true north, which is all around results. And I've heard people call it the true north results. But how you get those results and how they're connected to your purpose is one thing that we unpack in this white paper and talk about what we call true north. So the next white paper that came about, and it was an extension of that, had to do with side-by-side management. Now, one interesting thing about this white paper is we know the most familiar model in an organization, when people think about where they fit in the organization, is a pyramid view. And we turn that counterclockwise 90 degrees, and it pulls in some of the research that's been done in physics, primarily around a gentleman by the name of Adrian Bijan, with what he described as a new law of physics called the constructal law. It has to do with this framework, what it does to help facilitate flow of information, facilitate flow of knowledge. And so we think that that's important, and it laid the foundation for another view that we build on in subsequent white papers that has to do, if you turn the org chart sideways and think about where do people need to be spending most of their time or attention if they're in leader, manager, or frontline role, it's going to be different. And so that led to a future white paper, or a series of white papers, that unpack this a little bit more. And it started with the strategy system, or what we call the Pracademic's Guide to Strategy Deployment. So it really is a white paper about this top triangle here. What have we learned? What have we seen using conversations with colleagues as well as thought leaders, as far as what are people learning as far as developing strategy, deploying strategy, and then monitoring, evaluating strategy, and what's the role that every person in the organization plays in that, and how much do they need to know about those sorts of things, preparing the organization for the future. And we do this through a series of top 10 lessons, and there's certainly many lessons that could be learned. We had to have a cutoff point. We just said, well, let's think about this as sort of like a top 10 list. So that was that white paper, which then led to a need to have a discussion about the other two parts of that diagram, starting with the Managing for Daily Improvement system, or that bottom triangle there, which has to do with responding to, dealing with problems, issues day to day to meet the needs of the customers, the problems of today, and how is that organized and thought about. And then finally, the last white paper that it was written. So the two that are most recent are the Managing for Daily Improvement system and the Leader Standard Work system. The Leader Standard Work system is sort of the glue that holds those two systems together. It's one way to think about it. And it has to do with what is the routine that a leader, and a leader at whatever level of the organization it is, could be an executive, could be a director, could be a vice president, could be a manager, could be a supervisor. What's the routine that they build, their personal management system, and how do you experiment with that? And we pull in a number of topics here, including the ideas of working on the system and in the system relative to this. So again, it's just one way to think about this topic of leader standard work. Now there is another page. I talked about the publications page, and there are some white papers that aren't listed here that if you're interested in, I'll just point them out. There's a paper that was going to be presented at the Deming Research Conference in 2016. Performance evaluation, how is this still a thing? Myself and a team of people did some research on what's the current state of performance evaluation, and also brought in thought leadership from people like Peter Schultes, Dr. Deming, and others about what is the pitfall of this annual performance evaluation, and researched what's the current state. And we did find a couple companies that no longer do this, and we learned about what they've substituted for it. The Deming Research Conference was, they no longer do that, but we pulled this paper together, so we made it into a white paper that other people may benefit. And we may come back and update that. Another white paper comes from, also from a Deming Research Summit conference, is a reprint of a presentation that I made, Understanding and Managing Variation in Healthcare. And then prior to that, Understanding and Application of Dr. Deming's System of Profound Knowledge in Healthcare. And if you want to go way back, my son and I, my oldest son Jerry, wrote a white paper, or a paper that was published in a publication called Quality Goes to School. And we described the red bead factory and what do grades mean. So you might find that of interest. So I'm going to unmute the phones, see if there's any questions, comments, feedback. People have told me, some people have told me that they found good use of having access to these white papers, and that they tell me that it's giving them some things to share with other people as they're trying to explain this to others. So anecdotally, I've received that feedback. If anybody would like to share any more about perhaps how they've used those white papers or how they might wish to use them a little bit more, this would be a great time to share their perspective, either by chat function or by just talking. Well, Dirk's got a comment. He says, I use the papers as a background framework of knowledge and how these ideas all fit together. That's what I've heard other people do too, is it's kind of a personal use, something to go back to. We try to tie in connections to thought leaders, others in the field that have contributed to this. And so thanks for that comment, Dirk. He says his microphone isn't working, so I'll speak for him. Any other feedback, comments?
Mike, this is Dirk. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, right. Got my microphone working. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so the other thought I had was, in light of this, is one key question that I'm wrestling with is, even with this information, one of the difficulties, even though we've got this nicely defined in these white papers, it's still really difficult to bring the message across in the organization, especially with leadership, to start getting that embedded and getting understanding of this knowledge. Mm-hmm. So that is still a challenge. So the practical implementation aspect of this, I think, has some challenges and some opportunities for further investigation. And how do we go about doing that? And there are probably different avenues to do that.
Right.
And then with that, the comment and with inherent question is, so how do we do that, and what can we do to come up with something that is generically useful for everybody in these transformation roles? And then particularly, how do we overcome the tenacious holds that classical management mindsets and thinking and practices have on how organizations are run today? Because it's not as simple as just turning the diagram of the organizational hierarchical structure on its side. there's an inherent resistance to doing that. So the question then becomes, how do we bridge that piece of it? Because that's kind of pivotal to successful transformations in the end anyway.
Yeah. And I think we're going to be touching on some of these things, beginning with some of the presentations the next couple months.
Right.
And I would guess that this is good fodder for any of these monthly webinars where it's going to be possible for people to say, I want to talk about this aspect a little bit more. And let's put something down and say, what have you done? What have you tried thus far? What worked? What didn't? Any assistance from anybody on the call to give any guidance or help would certainly be of benefit, I think, or at least, talking through with others. Because it can be pretty lonely if you're in the organization or trying to figure something out. And sometimes it helps to talk to colleagues. This is a pretty easy way to talk to a lot of colleagues. You don't have to get on a plane. You don't have to, adjust schedules. It's just being available for a discussion. And that's one of the reasons why we tried to design these white papers or these webinars and the white papers to be pertinent that way. So don't lose that thought. We do want to get to that, and we're going to be digging into that deeper as we get into some of these presentations the next couple months. Any other questions or comments or feedback? Okay. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it back on mute because I want to minimize any background noise, but thank you for those comments. And what I want to do now is to talk about, so what happens next. As is the case, the recording from this webinar gets moved into a queue that people can have access to it. So if you go to our webinar page and you can see what happens, we put it into the previous events, and you can always go back and find the link to the recording and refer to it that way. We did have a webinar on the topic of frontline leader standard work scheduled for May, and our presenter had a change in his schedule, so that's when it's going to be rescheduled. And so I'm looking forward to that presentation. I don't think Didier's on the call today, but anyway, I reached out to him and we're trying to find a date that we can reschedule that. Now, the series of webinars that I've been referring to in the last couple minutes started with a question from Garrett Bean from Presbyterian Health, who asked this question. I'm just going to read it. He said it would be great to have a webinar in the future on what it really means to own principles, systems, and tools, and the corresponding behaviors. These behaviors are indirectly addressed in your white papers, but it might be helpful for the rest of us to have a clear picture of what it might look like. I think it would be helpful to have something framed this way, maybe one or several guest presenters. So behind the scenes, what we've been doing is starting with Garrett, and then a few other people chimed in. I extended an invitation to a number of folks that said, would you be interested in to present on this question and your approach to this question? So as a result of that, there have been 4 webinars that have been scheduled, and we may have more because, again, only part of the population responded to this. So in July, on the 19th, Garrett and then also Brian Taylor, who's with York Hospital in WellSpan Health, are going to each be presenting a little bit of background on who they are, what they've been doing, what experiments they've been running around this question, what they've learned works, what they learned didn't, and then also sharing what they're currently wrestling with or what they plan to do next as far as a further experiment. So roughly 20 to 30 minutes per presenter, allowing some time for Q&A. It's going to be something that's going to be a snippet, a picture of their perspective, and it most certainly could lead to a full presentation by any of these presenters in the future. But we paired people up to give presentations, so you could find the information for this one on the URL link, the bit.ly link that you see on this page. So that'll be number 1. Number 2 occurs in August, same format. We've got Jamie Silva Steele and then Yvette Senna from Sandoval Regional Medical Center in New Mexico. And then also Lisa Radke and Sarah Grew from Winneshiek Medical Center in Iowa. So same routine there, their perspective, their experiments, what's worked, what hasn't. Presentation number 3, getting into September. Fletch Corbett and Caleb Foss from Munson Healthcare. And then Dirk Van Rossum, who you heard speak earlier a bit on this. They're going to present their perspectives on this. And then the fourth one that we have scheduled, October 18th, Holly Prest from Kimberly Area School District. I mentioned her previously, and Sid from the Mayo Clinic in La Crosse, Wisconsin, have agreed to give their perspective in a bit of time. Some of this will be from the perspective of individuals, how they've looked at this. Some of this will be from the perspective of organizations or teams and how they've looked at it. And so the idea is that we'll hear from a number of these people from their perspectives. And hopefully that's going to be a good benefit. And I think that it'll probably lead to some future presentations similar to this, either by individuals or groups of people that are going to share a bit of their perspective. Now we've got another number of other topics that are in the works. So I seem to add to this list each month. Going back to Ann and Lou Freeze on natural leadership. They're interested in doing part 2. Angela Swenson and Dirk talked about the lessons and learnings of Sensei, what worked, what hasn't. Kevin McNamara, CEO at Tidy Products, has given some presentations on his experiments with leader standard work as the CEO for his company, and he's willing to do that again. Ken Eakin, who is currently writing a book, has agreed to share his thoughts on the topic of office lean and understanding and implementing the flow in professional administrative environments. Still going to do some work on designing and adjusting leader standard work, perhaps on roughly a quarterly basis. More deep dives in complexity science and the Cynefin framework that I've touched upon briefly. Jason Ewing, he did a presentation with IT on We Are Hoarders of Technology, is interesting, doing a follow-up. And then a gentleman that I met through a mutual contact, Brooks Carter, published a paper in the Quality Progress lesson from George Washington that he would like to do a webinar, or maybe it'll appear more like a podcast, but that'll be done in the future. If you want to read the paper that Brooks has written, you can get it by going to that bit.ly link there, and look forward to that presentation in the future. If you're in the Twin Cities area in July 23rd, in partnership with the Performance Excellence Network, we'll be doing a System by Design course. So that is a hands-on, face-to-face unpacking of at least what we have put in a high level in our white paper on Systems by Design. So you can go to that bit.ly link and learn more about taking advantage of that. I imagine there'll be more opportunities like that in the future. And as I mentioned, and talking about the principles, we've selected a principle of the month to reflect on and talk about. And if you go to our website, you can find it on our blog on that link. You can also find it if we're connected on LinkedIn. The same conversation that shows up on the blog is also showing up on LinkedIn. And we've covered a number of principles thus far. So in January, it was constancy of purpose. There were 5 reflections, and you can see the bit.ly links that can take you either to our blog or to LinkedIn. We've had 4 reflections on respect every individual. We had 4 reflections on focus on process. We had 4 on create value for the customer. And then we had 5 on the principle of lead with humility. So these just sort of timed out on what it looks like for each week of the month. And 2 thus far on assure quality at the source. And in the process of writing a 3rd one that's going to show up next Monday on this topic. So what we talked about today is always open for input and information and suggestions. This idea that has resulted in the 4 webinars over the next couple months started with a suggestion from Garrett Bean, and it could be a similar suggestion from anybody that's on our webinar list. So that's what I've got for today. I hope that everyone has a good day, and if you're traveling, travel safe. Thanks again for taking the time to be here.
Thanks, Mike.
Take care.